Without warning, the millionaire decided to visit his employee's house. He never imagined that when he opened that door, he would discover a secret that would change his life forever. It was Thursday morning, and Emiliano Arriaga had woken up earlier than usual. He had slept little, not because of insomnia or stress, but because he had been thinking about something for days that he couldn't get out of his head. That something had a name and surname, Julia Mendez. Not because he was in love with her, or at least not yet, but because he had begun to notice details that had previously gone unnoticed. Julia was his housekeeper. She had been working in his mansion for more than 5 years. She was never late, never complained, and always had a smile on her face, even though she had dark circles under her eyes and her back was hunched from exhaustion. Emiliano had never interfered in her personal life. He was respectful, yes, but he was also a busy man, owner of several companies, accustomed to everything revolving around him and with a schedule full of meetings, trips, and events that he sometimes didn't even remember. But something about Julia had caught his attention lately. It wasn't just one thing, it was an accumulation of moments. The time she fainted while cleaning the garden, the way her eyes glazed over when she was talking on the phone and thought no one could hear her, or the day she broke down silently in tears while washing the dishes, unaware that he had seen her from the terrace. That Thursday, Emiliano canceled an important meeting and asked for his truck to be prepared. He didn't want to send her a check or a gift card by mail. This time he wanted to see her. He had decided to go to her house without warning. He told his assistant he was taking the morning off and left alone, without bodyguards, without a driver, and without telling anyone else. Getting to where Julia lived was not easy. She never talked about her personal life and had never even given an exact address. Emiliano, with the help of a clue found on an old data sheet, managed to locate the neighborhood. It was a simple area with narrow streets, houses with walls worn down by time and sun, and an atmosphere very different from what he was used to. When he finally arrived, he got out of the car feeling a little nervous. He didn't know if he was doing the right thing. He didn't want to intrude, but his curiosity and that kind of restlessness that had been haunting him were stronger. He knocked on the door and waited. No one answered. He knocked again, louder. From inside, he could hear voices, hurried footsteps, and then the sound of an old lock turning with effort. The door opened just a crack. A girl of about 7 looked at him with surprise. She had big eyes, a faded t-shirt with cartoon characters on it, and a makeshift hairstyle that had clearly been done in a hurry. "Are you looking for my Aunt Julia?" she asked fearlessly but in a low voice. Emiliano crouched down a little, smiled, and said yes. The girl ran inside and shouted her aunt's name. A few seconds later, Julia appeared with her hair half up, sweat on her forehead, and a stained apron. When she saw him, she froze. "Mr. Emiliano, what are you doing here?" I didn't know if she was upset, surprised, or scared. Maybe a little of everything. He raised his hands as if he were surrendering. "Don't be scared. I just wanted to give you this." He took a white envelope out of his jacket. "It's a bonus for your work. You've been amazing all these years, and I wanted to thank you in person." Julia took it with trembling hands. She looked inside as if wondering whether to pass it on or not. It was only a second of silence, but it was enough for Emiliano to notice what was beyond the entrance. From where he stood, he could see an oxygen tank, a wheelchair, an elderly man staring at the television, which was turned off, and in a corner, lying on a cot with very pale skin and a pained expression. He also saw the boy, a little older than the girl, with a homework notebook in his hands. Everything in that scene hit him hard. This was not the home of a maid who was going to rest after work. This was the home of a woman who never rested. Julia noticed his gaze and lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry for the mess. I wasn't expecting visitors." "Don't worry," he replied. "Are you alone with all of them?" She hesitated, took a deep breath, and nodded. "My mom has been sick for a year. She can't move much. My dad had an accident 6 months ago and is in a wheelchair. The children are my sisters. She and her husband died in a car crash. Since then, I've been taking care of them." She said nothing more. She didn't complain. She didn't make excuses. Emiliano couldn't say a word. His whole world, so full of luxury, comfort, employees, and assistants who solved any problem, suddenly felt ridiculous. He looked at Julia, and for the first time, he didn't see her as the woman who cleaned his house, but as someone who carried a whole universe on her shoulders and still got up every day with a smile. "Can I come in?" Julia hesitated. She turned to look at her mother, who couldn't speak but nodded slightly as if to say yes. Finally, she let him in. Emiliano walked slowly, not knowing what to do or where to look. He greeted Julia's father respectfully, stroked the head of the child who looked at him with some mistrust, and approached the sick woman who could barely move her hand to say hello. Julia explained in a few words what each one needed, the routine she followed, the medications, the hospital appointments. She said she slept only a few hours a night and that on weekends, instead of resting, she sold food to make a little more money. Emiliano did not interrupt, just listened to her with an attention he had never given anyone before. He stayed a while longer without asking any questions. Then he said goodbye with a promise he did not say out loud, but which was already decided in his heart. He was not going to leave her alone anymore. He left that house with a mixture of emotions that he did not know how to process. On the way back to his world of marble, air conditioning, and quiet offices, he felt that something inside him had changed. He didn't know what it was, but he knew that Julia Mendez was no longer going to be just another face among many. He had learned her truth, and that truth had touched him like nothing had in a long time. That night, Emiliano couldn't sleep. He went to bed early, as always, with the intention of reading for a while before closing his eyes. But he didn't get past the first page. He turned off the bedside lamp, changed position several times, and finally lay staring at the ceiling with his arms crossed. Images of that house kept appearing in his mind. Julia's voice explaining everything in that firm but exhausted tone, the dull gaze of his prostrate mother, the silence of his father who couldn't get up from the armchair, and those two little children who had no idea of the size of the world they had to face. For any other boss, that visit would have been an anecdote, a story to tell at a meeting, something that would make them look generous and human. But Emiliano wasn't like that. He had grown up in a family where people mattered. Before she died, his mother repeatedly told him not to look only at those at the top, but also at those whom everyone ignores. And he, although over time he had become so involved in his companies, still kept pieces of that lesson deep inside. The next day, without saying anything to anyone, he searched through his personal files for all the information he had on Julia Mendez. The little there was very basic. Date of birth, address, social security number, a couple of job references, nothing about her family, her education, her past. He went to his office and asked not to be disturbed. Then he searched his computer, social media, public records, until he began to piece together a kind of puzzle that left him frozen. Julia had lost her older sister in a car accident on the highway just 2 years ago. Her husband also died in the crash. The children miraculously survived, but with some injuries. Custody had been assigned to Julia without much ado, not because it was the original plan, but because there was no one else. Her parents were alive, yes, but her mother had health problems at the time, and her father was retired. He could barely make ends meet. Then came his father's accident, which left him in a wheelchair, and a few months later, his mother's diagnosis of advanced cancer. All of this had happened in less than 3 years. Emiliano was speechless. At that moment, he understood many things. He understood why Julia never asked for days off. Why did she always rush out at the same time? Why didn't she talk to anyone else on staff? Why did she never agree to stay late, even if she was offered double pay? She was struggling to support her entire family alone, in silence, without asking for anything. He felt angry, not at her, but at himself for not realizing it sooner, for having had right in front of him a woman who was carrying the weight of 4 people and not even taking the time to ask her if she was okay. That same day, he called his assistant again, but this time not to ask for coffee or schedule a meeting. He asked her to put him in touch with a trusted nurse, to get certain medications, to buy basic groceries, and to set aside a few hours in his schedule for the next day. He gave no further explanation. When he arrived at Julia's house, it was Saturday morning. The same girl who had opened the door for him earlier saw him coming through the window and ran out to tell her. Julia greeted him with the look of someone who no longer knows what to expect. She didn't look upset, but she did look tired, the kind of tired that doesn't go away with 8 hours of sleep. "Here again?" she asked with a small smile. I didn't come alone this time, Emiliano replied, pointing to the truck. From the back of the truck, a woman in her 50s got out wearing a white uniform and carrying a folder in her hand. Then her assistant began to unload bags full of fruit, vegetables, milk, cereal, meat, medicine, and cleaning supplies. Julia was speechless. The children watched from the doorway as if it were Christmas. I don't want you to take this the wrong way, Emiliano said sincerely. I just want to help you a little. I couldn't get what I saw the other day out of my head. Julia didn't know how to react. Her instinct was to say no, that it wasn't necessary, that everything was under control. But when she saw how the nurse approached her mother with respect, how she took her blood pressure, how she spoke to her gently, something inside her softened. For the first time in a long time, she felt that someone else was there to support her, not to judge her. For the rest of the morning, Emiliano stayed to help, not with his hands, but with his presence. He listened, asked questions, and took notes. He wanted to understand what Julia's life was really like. Little by little, she told him more, that she barely slept 3 or 4 hours a night, that money was tight, that her son had attention problems at school, that her daughter was afraid that one day she would die and leave them alone. I don't mind working, Julia told him while washing some cups. But there are days when I feel like I'm not going to be able to, and then I see my parents. I see the kids, and I force myself to keep going. Because if I don't do it, who will? That phrase stuck with Emiliano. Who was she? That Saturday marked a turning point. Emiliano didn't know it yet, but at that moment, he began to see Julia with different eyes. She was no longer just his employee. She was a woman with a story, a hard, complicated story, but also one full of courage. She had no partner, no siblings, no time for friends or complaints, only responsibilities, which she faced every day without complaint. Before leaving, she left Julia a card with the nurse's number, whom she planned to pay weekly to come twice a day to check on her mother. He also told her that if she needed anything at all, she could call him. Julia thanked him with a broken voice. She didn't cry. She wasn't one to cry in front of others. But Emiliano saw how she bit her lip to hold back the tears, and that was enough. When he got into the van, he looked back at the house from the window. He didn't know what was going to happen next. He only knew that he could no longer look at Julia as he had before, nor could he go on with his life pretending he hadn't seen what he had seen. That woman was carrying a mountain on her shoulders, and he, who had all the resources in the world, was not going to stand by with his arms crossed. What no one knew about Julia, he now knew, and that had changed him forever. Since Emiliano left her house that Saturday morning, Julia couldn't feel calm. She was grateful for the help. Of course she did. No one in her situation could refuse a professional nurse or food that would last for several weeks. But there was something that turned her stomach, something that made her feel vulnerable, exposed, as if someone had opened the door to her private world, and now everyone could see the mess she had been hiding for years. While folding the children's clothes in the afternoon, she stood still for a few seconds looking out the window. Her heart was tight. She felt like she was losing control of her life, and that scared her. Since her parents had fallen ill and the children had arrived, she had learned to live without depending on anyone. Doing everything alone was difficult, yes, but at least she had the certainty that no one could take anything away from her or meddle in her life. Now with Emiliano involved, things were different, and that made her feel uncomfortable. Not because she didn't trust him, but because she didn't know how to act in front of so much attention. The following days were strange. Emiliano didn't return to her house or recall her, but the nurse arrived every day on time with a notebook where she wrote down every improvement Julia's mother made. She even brought a doctor one afternoon without warning. They examined the woman with the utmost care. They talked to Julia about more comfortable treatments and offered to arrange medication through a foundation. Julia didn't really understand where all this was coming from, but she suspected that Emiliano was behind every detail. At work, things also started to feel strange. Emiliano was still the same reserved and serious man as always, but now he greeted her with a different smile. It was no longer the friendly, neutral greeting she was used to. It was one that lingered a second longer, as if he wanted to say something but didn't dare. Sometimes when he passed her in the hallway, he would stop just to ask if everything was okay, if the children were feeling better, if she needed anything else. Julia always responded with the same phrase, "Everything's fine, thank you." But inside, the discomfort grew. 2 weeks passed like this. The silence between them wasn't cold, but it was heavy, like those conversations that are never spoken, but can be felt in the air. Julia, while mopping the floors or folding towels, asked herself questions she didn't know how to answer. What did Emiliano want? Why had he suddenly become so interested in her life? Was he doing this out of pity? Was it a moral debt he felt he had to pay? Or was there something else? One afternoon, while cleaning the windows on the balcony floor, Julia saw him sitting on the terrace alone with a cup of coffee, staring into the garden. She hesitated for a few seconds, then went downstairs with the empty tray she had to collect. When she approached the terrace, Emiliano looked up and smiled at her, but this time he didn't say anything. Julia placed the tray on the table carefully, without looking at him directly. "Would you like some more coffee?" she asked in a low voice. "No, thank you. That's fine." There was a long silence. She was about to leave, but he stopped her. "Julia, can I ask you a question?" She stood still, next to the table, not knowing whether to say yes or no. Finally, she nodded. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" The question threw her off balance. She didn't know what he meant exactly. "Nothing about your family, about everything you're going through. You've worked here for years and never mentioned anything." Julia took a deep breath. She knew this moment was coming, but it still caught her off guard because it's nobody's business. "I came here to work, not to share my problems." Emiliano looked down and took a sip of his coffee. He wasn't angry, but he did seem confused. "I'm not saying this to invade your privacy. I just don't know. I find it hard to understand how you can cope with so much. Every day, you come here, do your job, smile, and then you go home and carry an entire house on your shoulders. You never get tired." Julia leaned on the railing and looked him straight in the eyes for the first time. "Of course I get tired every day, but I have no choice. I have no one to take over for me. My parents need me, and so do the kids. Sometimes I wish I had time for myself, to sit down like you are now and have a coffee without thinking about anything. But that doesn't happen, so I get up, take a deep breath, and keep going. That's all there is." The silence that followed was more uncomfortable than before. Emiliano was speechless, even though he was used to giving speeches, negotiating contracts, and appearing on television. But in front of that woman, with those simple words, he didn't know what to say. Julia, noticing the awkwardness, decided to end the conversation. "I'm going to keep cleaning the windows in the hallway. Have a good afternoon." Emiliano didn't stop her, just watched her walk away with firm steps. There was no anger in her voice, no sadness, no complaint, just truth. A truth that weighed more than any speech. That afternoon, Emiliano sat there until the sun began to set. He still felt a strange mixture of admiration and frustration. He didn't want Julia to see him as someone who was forcing his way into her life, but he also didn't want to stay on the sidelines. He knew that if he made a wrong move, she would close herself off forever, but if he did nothing, he might lose her too. Julia, for her part, returned home that day more confused than ever. She felt grateful to him, yes, but also exposed. She could no longer hide as she had before. Now someone else knew what was going on inside those four walls. Someone who had power, resources, and something else she didn't dare name. Interest. That uncomfortable silence between them. It wasn't just because of what had been said, but because of everything that still hadn't dared to come out. What neither of them knew was that this silence was only the beginning, because what came next could no longer be hidden behind measured words or polite. They were entering uncharted territory, and they both knew it, even though neither of them said anything. Ever since he had that conversation with Julia on the terrace, Emiliano began to see her differently, not because she had changed, but because now he knew. He knew everything she was carrying. He knew what she was going through every day, and with that information, he could no longer treat her as if she were just the girl who cleaned. She wasn't that anymore, or rather, she never had been. He was the one who had taken so long to notice the way she walked around the house, focused on her work, which began to seem admirable to him. Before, her silent footsteps went unnoticed. Now he noticed them. He noticed how she did 3 things at the same time without losing patience, how she carefully arranged the curtains, how she made sure to leave the armchairs lined up just the way he liked them, without anyone asking her to. She was detail-oriented, efficient, dedicated, and human, very human. But there was something else. Emiliano could feel it. Something inside him had begun to stir, to grow without asking permission. At first, he didn't want to accept it. It wasn't possible that he, with so many women around him, with his life so organized, with his routine so well established, was beginning to look at a woman like Julia. Not because she didn't deserve it, but because they came from such different worlds that it was logical that their paths would never cross. But logic no longer mattered. One afternoon, while he was in his office reviewing some contracts, he realized that he had been looking out the window for more than 2 minutes without reading a single word of the document in front of him. He had Julia in his head again, her face, her voice, the way she talked about her family, the slight tremor in her hands when she offered him help and he didn't know whether to accept or not. All of that had him hooked. He dialed his chauffeur's number and canceled a business dinner he had scheduled for weeks. Instead, he got into his truck and drove straight to the place where he knew he could see her without having to make an appointment, her house. Julia was hanging clothes in the backyard when she heard the noise of the engine. She looked up and saw him getting out of the car with a bag in his hand. He greeted her with a soft smile, as if he were already part of that house. "I brought you something," he said, lifting the bag again. Julia responded with her eyes half closed. "It's nothing special, just a cake. I got it at a company meeting and thought the kids might like it." Julia hesitated for a second. It wasn't the cake, it was him, his presence, his way of showing up unannounced. But she invited him in anyway. This time there were no nerves or explanations. Emiliano came in, greeted the father respectfully, asked the mother how she was feeling, and was welcomed by the children as if he were already a family member. The youngest, Valeria, even hung on his arm and asked him to help her open a new game she had been given at school. They stayed in the living room for a while. Emiliano ate cake with the children, listened to the stories they told him as if they were great adventures, and even laughed heartily when the boy Matteo showed him a drawing of himself as a millionaire superboss with a cape. Julia watched them from the kitchen in silence. She didn't understand what was happening. Seeing Emiliano in her house, dressed in casual clothes, sitting in his old armchair, with a napkin in his hand and crumbs on his shirt. It was her real home, and yet he looked comfortable, calm, as if he belonged there. When the children went to play, Julia sat down with him at the small dining room table. "Why are you doing this?" she asked bluntly. "This, coming here, helping, being here. What are you looking for?" Emiliano looked down. He didn't want to say something that sounded forced. He wanted to tell the truth. "I'm not looking for anything. I just can't pretend I don't really know you. Before, I only saw what you did. Now I see who you are, and that changed everything." Julia remained silent, not because she had nothing to say, but because she didn't know how to handle what she was hearing. "You don't have to take responsibility for me or my life," she said seriously. "I'm used to people coming, helping for a while, and then forgetting. It's happened before. So if this is temporary, you better tell me now." "It's not temporary," Emiliano said firmly. "I didn't come here to feel better or to make you feel guilty. I came because I want to be here, because I care about you." Julia didn't know how to respond. She looked at him with her eyes wide open, as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. "I care about you, much more than I ever thought I could care about anyone." Silence returned, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence filled with things that weren't said, but that were felt strongly. Julia got up, went to check on her mother, who was sleeping in the bedroom, came back with a glass of water and offered it to Emiliano. She said nothing else, just sat down in front of him as if accepting his presence without promises, without demands, without certainties, just for that moment. And Emiliano stayed. He stayed there without a watch, without a cell phone, without thinking about meetings or pending emails. He stayed because for the first time in a long time, he felt that this place, however humble it was, had something that his mansion had never given him. That night, when he returned home, he took off his jacket, loosened his tie, and sank into the armchair. He sat there in silence with a calm smile. What he had felt at Julia's house was something new to him, something that couldn't be bought, planned, or forced. It was real. And although he hadn't said it out loud yet, he already knew it. Julia wasn't just the woman who cleaned his floors or served his coffee. She was someone who was changing his life without asking for anything in return, and he could no longer ignore it, nor did he want to. Monday dawned cloudy, the kind of morning that seems to announce that something important is about to happen. Emiliano woke up early, but this time he didn't run to the gym or sit down at the computer like he usually did. He stayed in bed staring at the ceiling, going over in his head the words he didn't dare say to Julia the night before. He had already crossed a line and he knew it. It wasn't a forbidden line or one of those lines you regret crossing, but it was one of those lines that changed the course of your life forever. When he arrived at the office, he barely greeted his team, ordered coffee, and went straight to his office. He sat down, opened his notebook, and wrote on the first page, "It's not help, it's companionship." He crossed it out. He wrote another sentence. "She doesn't expect it, but I need it." He crossed that out too. Finally, he closed the notebook and sighed. He didn't know how to express what he was feeling. The only thing he knew was that he wanted to see her again. Not as his boss, not as his benefactor, but as a man. A man who was beginning to feel things for someone he never imagined. And so he decided that this time his visit would not be just out of courtesy, it would be with intention. He wanted to show Julia that he wasn't going to disappear like everyone else, that he wasn't there out of pity or guilt, that he admired her and wanted to be part of her life, not just a spectator. In the middle of the afternoon, he got into his truck. In the passenger seat, he had a cardboard box, carefully prepared. Inside were notebooks, crayons, children's books, and a new tablet with an educational app installed, all designed for children. And in another bag, a couple of packages with medicine he had gotten from a doctor friend for the treatment of Julia's mother. It wasn't much, but it was something, and he had done it with all his heart. He arrived at the neighborhood without warning, like the first time, but this time when he knocked on the door, he didn't feel out of place. Valeria, the little girl, opened the door again with her usual smile. "Uncle Emmy!" she shouted as soon as she saw him, running to hug him tightly. Emiliano bent down and picked her up without thinking. Uncle Emmy, that phrase brought a smile to her face that didn't fade all afternoon. Julia appeared seconds later, drying her hands with a towel. She had the look of someone who wasn't expecting visitors, but deep down was glad to see him. She didn't say anything, just looked at him with a mixture of surprise and resignation, as if accepting that there were things she could no longer control. "I brought you something for the kids," said Emiliano, holding up the box. Julia didn't answer. She stepped aside and let him pass. Valeria and Matteo ran to open the box as if it were a treasure chest. When they saw the tablet, they both screamed with excitement. Julia crossed her arms, holding back a smile. She didn't want to show too much, but inside she felt a warmth running through her whole body. "I also brought this," said Emiliano, taking out the medicine. "I don't know if you need them yet, but a doctor recommended them. If they don't work, we can exchange them." Julia took the bags carefully. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. She had never liked crying in front of anyone. She thanked him quietly and went to put the things away in the kitchen. While the children played, Emiliano stayed while with Julia's father, asking him about his accident and offering to take him to see a physical therapist and also offering to adjust his wheelchair. Don Manuel, who was serious and reserved, looked at him suspiciously but then thanked him with a curt gesture, as only men who have lived too long know how to do. Julia's mother was also more alert that day. The nurse, who continued to visit every day, said that she was responding well to the new treatment. Emiliano crouched down next to her, took her hand, and spoke to her slowly. It wasn't many words, but they were sincere. The lady looked at him with a silent tenderness, as if she already accepted him as part of her family. Julia returned to the room, sat down in a chair in front of him, and looked at him seriously. "I understand that you are not going to stop until I say something." Emiliano smiled. "Maybe. Well, I'll tell you once and for all, I'm not ready for anything. I don't know what you want. I don't know what you expect, but I'm broken, Emiliano. I don't have the time or the energy or the headspace to bring someone else into my life. I can barely cope with what I've got." He wasn't surprised. It was exactly what he expected, but he didn't leave. "I don't want you to get me involved. I just want to stay close. Help you if you let me. Listen to you. Nothing more." Julia crossed her arms and stared at him intently. Why? What makes you think I'm worth all this effort? Because I see you for who you really are. And I don't know if you notice, but there's something about you that won't let me walk away. Julia remained silent. She didn't know whether to respond with anger or fear. She was used to people leaving, not staying. But something inside her, a small part that had learned to keep quiet, began to awaken. Maybe, just maybe, this man was telling the truth. Emiliano didn't press her, didn't try to kiss her or touch her hand. He just sat there making it clear with his presence that he wasn't in a hurry, that he wasn't going to rush, that he could wait. The children continued playing until they fell asleep on the couch, one hugging the tablet and the other with crayons in her hand. Julia looked at them and went over to cover them with a blanket. Emiliano got up and helped her carefully. "You don't have to do this alone, Julia," he said softly. She looked at him for a few seconds, then lowered her eyes. "I don't know how to do anything else, so let me learn from you." It was a simple phrase, unadorned, but it hung in the air like a silent promise. Julia didn't answer, just walked him to the door when he decided to leave. There were no hugs or long goodbyes, but just as he was about to get into the truck, she called him from the doorway. "Thanks for coming. Thanks for letting me in." And he left. But that night, Julia stayed up later than usual. She wasn't thinking about the medication, or the kids, or the money. She was thinking about Emiliano, about how he looked at her, how he listened to her, how he hadn't tried to change anything. But even so, he was already changing everything. The following Monday began like any other. Julia got up before dawn, made breakfast for the children, organized her mother's medications, helped her father with his bath, and got everything ready before leaving the house. As always, she bent down to kiss the two little ones and repeat the phrase that was part of the routine. "Behave yourselves, and if anything happens, call me." But that morning, before leaving, she paused for a moment. She stood looking at the wall clock as if something was missing, although she didn't know what it was. It was only a second, but inside she felt it. Emiliano wouldn't get out of her head. In the mansion, everything remained the same. The same immaculate hallways, the same elegant silence, the same smell of expensive coffee and waxed furniture. But for Julia, it was no longer the same. Ever since Emiliano started visiting her at her house, ever since she saw him playing with her nephews, ever since she heard him talk to her dad as if an old friend, and how he bent down to take his mother's hand without fear, something inside her had begun to stir. It wasn't that she was falling in love, or at least she didn't allow herself to think so yet, but there was something different about the way she looked at him. Now, when she saw him crossing the garden talking on the phone, or when she found him in the kitchen looking through papers, she felt closer to him, less bossy, more human. And that unsettled her because Julia had spent years building a wall to protect herself. A wall made of duties, schedules, strength, and I can do it alone. And suddenly Emiliano was finding cracks to peek through. Mid-morning, while she was washing the windows in the main living room, she saw him come in. He was dressed in dark jeans and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He looked relaxed, without the hurry that usually accompanied him. He was carrying a folder in one hand and a coffee in the other. Julia looked down and continued cleaning, but he approached her with a light smile. "Hello, good morning, Mr. Emiliano." "Mr. Emiliano," he repeated in a friendly, teasing tone. "We're past that stage, aren't we?" Julia turned around with the bottle of cleaner in her hand and replied without changing her tone. "Here, yes. Outside is another story. And which one do you like best?" She looked at him straight in the eye without fear. "The one that doesn't get me in trouble." There was a brief silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Emiliano understood that Julia needed her space, her rhythm, her time. She wasn't a woman who let herself be swept away by pretty words or exaggerated gestures. If he wanted to get closer to her, he had to do it without pushing. And that, instead of frustrating him, he liked. Throughout the day, they crossed paths several times. He went downstairs to check some construction plans, and she went upstairs with the cleaning cart. Sometimes their arms brushed against each other accidentally, or they exchanged quick glances, as if neither of them knew quite what to do with the tension growing in the air. It was subtle but constant. There were no words, but there was a kind of electricity floating between them, one that they both pretended not to notice, even though their bodies spoke for themselves. In the afternoon, Emiliano went out to the garden with his laptop. He had a video call, but the signal in his office was failing. Julia saw him from the kitchen while she mopped the floor. He was speaking in English with someone abroad in that confident, firm tone he used in business. And yet at the same time, he looked relaxed, almost happy, as if being there in the open air, in that simple space, made him feel more like himself. Julia didn't know it, but from his chair, Emiliano was watching her too. He looked at her without her noticing while she scrubbed the floor vigorously, tied her hair back in a makeshift bun, and paused for a second to stretch her back and let out a sigh. He watched her and felt that he was looking at a real woman, one who wasn't pretending, who wasn't trying to impress him, who didn't need makeup or expensive dresses to get his attention. And that was what attracted him the most. Later, when she was putting the cleaning products away in the utility room, he approached her with 2 bottles of water in his hand, offered her one, and sat down on the chair next to her without saying a word. Julia hesitated but accepted. She sat down too, her legs tired and her mind exhausted. "Today was a hard day, wasn't it?" he asked, breaking the silence. "They all are. You get used to it. You shouldn't have to get used to being tired. And you shouldn't be sitting here with me, but here you are." The river. A sincere laugh without tension. Then he looked down and played with the bottle cap. "Sometimes I think you're testing me," he said. "Testing you, yes, as if you were waiting for me to get bored, to walk away, to get tired, as if you were waiting for me to be just like everyone else." Julia remained silent. She didn't deny it, but she didn't accept it either. "I don't like to get my hopes up," she said at last. "I don't have time for that. No head, no heart, sometimes. I'm not here to promise anything, Julia. I'm only here because I want to be. That's all." She looked at him, and for the first time there was not a hint of mistrust in her gaze. There was doubt, yes, there was fear, but there was also something new. A small crack where before there had only been a wall. That look, so hers, so direct, so unfiltered, was the exact moment when everything changed. They did nothing else. They didn't touch. They didn't get any closer than necessary. They didn't say sweet things to each other. But that afternoon, between bottles of water and random words, between glances that met by accident, Julia and Emiliano crossed an invisible threshold. From that day on, they were no longer boss and employee or acquaintances. They were 2 people who were beginning to see each other in a new light. And although neither of them said it out loud, they knew that what they were feeling wasn't going to disappear. It was only going to grow little by little, in its own way, slowly but surely. In Emiliano Arriaga's world, money wasn't the problem. The real mess was always people. People who pretended, who were looking for something, who approached him out of interest, who measured every step according to how much they could get out of it. That's why, over time, he had learned to keep his distance, not to open up, to keep his circle closed, and his heart even more so, until Julia appeared, of course. But just when Emiliano was beginning to let his guard down with her, another figure appeared that he knew all too well. Celeste Alvarado, tall, elegant, with a calculated smile and a sharp mind. They had been in a relationship years ago. At first it was passion, then business, and in the end, when it all fell apart, it turned into a Cold War, the kind where no one says anything openly, but everyone looks for a way to win. Celeste owned a real estate company that competed directly with Emiliano's. She was always one step behind, trying to catch up or surpass him. She admired him, yes, but she also envied him. She never admitted it out loud, but she couldn't stand being the ex of a man who didn't break after leaving her, much less one who continued to succeed as if nothing had happened. The bomb exploded one afternoon at a business event where investors, politicians, and important business people gathered. Emiliano arrived in his usual suit, calm, with his mind set on leaving early. He didn't like these parties full of masks, but there he was, fulfilling protocol, and there she was too, light blue, radiant as always, in her tight black dress, red lips, and that perfume that seemed to fill the air just by walking by. He approached her without hesitation, drink in hand and a smile on his face. "My favorite millionaire," she said, kissing him on the cheek. "Aren't you going to invite me to sit with you?" "You never were one to ask permission," Emiliano replied. He meant it half seriously, half jokingly. They sat down at one of the tables in the back and talked about business, the market, and their latest projects. Everything was normal until Celeste changed the tone. I've been hearing rumors. What kind? That you're more interested in your employee than in your schedule. Emiliano looked at her with a raised eyebrow. He knew that it wasn't just a comment, it was a disguised attack. I don't know what you're talking about. Come on, don't play dumb. The woman who cleans your house, the one who lives in a forgotten neighborhood, the one who has a sick family and 2 kids running around. Very soap opera, Emiliano, very you. He tensed up, not because it was a lie, but because of the tone with which she said it. Celeste wasn't speaking out of curiosity, she was speaking with venom. You're meddling in my personal life with ease. He tensed up, not because it was a lie, but because of the tone in which she said it. Celeste wasn't speaking out of curiosity, she was speaking with venom. You get into my personal life with impressive ease. I'm just worried about your image. You and I both know how this world works. One scandal, one stain, and it's all over. And you're playing with fire. Emiliano stood up. Thanks for your advice, but I didn't ask for it. Celeste also stood up, but this time she lowered her voice and moved closer. Be careful, Emiliano. Not everyone sees Julia through your eyes, and neither do I. She said no more. She turned around and walked away as if nothing had happened. But that phrase kept echoing in Emiliano's head all night. 2 days later, the dirty game began. Julia received a strange call while she was at home. A very friendly woman offered her a job at a cleaning company with better conditions, higher pay, and transportation included. Julia thanked her, but she didn't understand why they were calling her, as she had never sent her resume anywhere else. The next day, she received another call, this time for a job as a personal assistant. More money, fewer hours, almost as if they knew exactly what she needed. When she mentioned it to Emiliano during a quick coffee in the kitchen, he froze. He asked her for the name of the company that had contacted her. He said nothing, but as soon as she left the room, he grabbed his cell phone and dialed. Was that you? He asked bluntly. Me what? Don't play games, Celeste. You know what I mean? Are you getting paranoid? Are you in love? Or are you losing control? Why can't you just leave me alone? Because you bore me, Emiliano. But you belong to me, even if you don't like it. And I'm not going to let some random girl steal the attention you took away from me. She hung up without waiting for a response. That night, Emiliano couldn't help thinking about everything that was at stake. Celeste wasn't just any woman. She had money, power, connections. She could tarnish Julia's image without lifting a finger. All it would take was a rumor, a badly taken photo, an altered story. All it would take was for someone to believe that she was with him for his money, and the damage would be done. The worst part was that Julia had no idea who they were dealing with. She thought she had already been through the worst. Her sister's death, her parents' illness, the daily burden. But she didn't know this other kind of bout, the kind that isn't fought with screams or blows, but with disguised words, with movements in the shadows, with fake smiles. And Celeste, without a doubt, was the perfect threat. The woman who had no limits, who could stand to lose. The one who was willing to do anything to regain control, even if that meant crushing anyone in her path. Julia noticed the change in Emiliano. He was more serious, more alert, as if he were always waiting for something to happen. She asked him about it one night while they were clearing the table in the garden. Everything okay? Yes, I'm just tired. Tired of what? He looked at her and for a moment thought about telling her everything, but he stopped himself. He didn't want to get her involved. Not yet. So he just said, tired of people who don't know when to stop meddling in things that don't concern them. Julia didn't quite understand, but that night, before going to sleep, she had a feeling. She didn't know where it was coming from, but something in the air felt strange, as if someone was about to rob her of the peace she was just beginning to know. And she was right, because Celeste had already set her plan in motion. One that would not only call into question everything Julia and Emiliano were building, but would also force them to face the darkest side of that world, where love is not always enough to win. It had been a long week. Between work shifts, nurse visits, the children's homework, and never-ending chores, Julia barely had time to breathe. But there was something different in the air. For days, Emiliano had been looking for her more often, sometimes with an excuse, other times without saying a word, just to spend some time at home. He always arrived with something in his hands: fresh fruit, books for the children, medicine that was needed, or simply a smile that, without him knowing, anything just to spend some time at her house. He always arrived with something in his hands: fresh fruit, books for the children, medicine that was needed, or simply a smile that, without him knowing, gave Julia a little relief amidst the chaos. The afternoon of Friday seemed quiet. Emiliano had stopped by the pharmacy before going to see Julia. He knew it was no longer necessary to show up with gifts or help, but he did it anyway, not out of obligation, but because it came naturally to him. This time, he had also bought a small box of chocolate cookies. He remembered that Valeria loved them. When he arrived, he was greeted by Matteo, who, as soon as he saw him, told him enthusiastically that he had recited the entire multiplication table without making a mistake. "Did your Aunt Julia tell you that, or are you making it up?" Emiliano asked playfully. "She heard me, I swear," the boy shouted, running to find her to confirm. Julia came out of the kitchen drying her hands with a dishcloth. When she saw Emiliano, she smiled. It was a slight, honest, unfiltered smile. "Yes, it's true. This time he didn't make a mistake." "Then he deserves it," he said, taking out the cookies. "But you have to share, okay?" The children shouted and ran out to the yard. Julia and Emiliano stayed in the living room, sitting on the biggest couch. She had her hair half up, was wearing an old sweater, and her face was tired but beautiful. He had his shirt sleeves rolled up, his watch tucked into his pocket, his phone on silent. There was no world of meetings, no competition, no Celeste, just the two of them, in the comfortable silence that enveloped them when they were alone. "You know," he said suddenly, "when I'm here, I feel like everything else shuts down, as if nothing else matters." Julia looked down as if she didn't know what to do with those words. "There are no luxuries here, no rest, no space for anything, but there is peace," he replied. They remained silent. The children laughed in the distance. Outside, the sky was beginning to turn orange. Julia looked at him and noticed something different in his eyes, a mixture of tenderness and fear, of desire and respect, of restrained longing. Emiliano began to say but couldn't continue. He interrupted her, not with words but with a deep look. He leaned slightly toward her, slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. But Julia didn't move. She closed her eyes just a second before feeling Emiliano's lips brush against hers. It was a kiss, sincere, unhurried. It didn't have the force of overwhelming passion, but rather the sweetness of something that had been waited for patiently. It lasted a few seconds. Then they both pulled away a little, without letting go completely. They stood there looking at each other without knowingly what to say. Julia's heart was racing, and so was Emiliano's. Neither of them regretted it, but they both knew that kiss had changed things. "It wasn't my intention," he said in a low voice. "But you did it," she replied without anger. "Are you okay, Julia?" he asked hesitantly. "Yes, but I don't know what this means." "Whatever you want it to mean," and that was the end of the conversation. The children came running in asking for more cookies, and the moment was broken. They went back to their routine as if nothing had happened, but they both knew that something had happened, something important. That night, after Emiliano left, Julia sat on the edge of her bed with her head full of ideas. She wasn't a child. She knew what that kiss could lead to, not just for her, but for people. And at that moment, without knowing it, she was already preparing herself for what was to come. The next day, very early in the morning, she received a strange call. It was a woman with a professional tone. "Miss Julia Mendez?" "Yes, who is this?" "We're calling on behalf of Alvarado Real Estate. We have your profile in our system and we're interested in offering you a position as a management assistant. Flexible hours, salary higher than your current one, full benefits, and the possibility of working from home 2 days a week." Julia frowned. "My profile? I've never worked in real estate, we know, but someone spoke very highly of you. Are you interested?" Julia didn't know what to say. She thanked her for calling and hung up. She felt a pressure in her chest. Something didn't add up, and her intuition, which was rarely wrong, told her that this was no coincidence. Hours later, when Emiliano arrived home as usual, she was waiting for him at the door. She greeted him seriously with her arms crossed. "Do you know something called Alvarado Real Estate?" Emiliano froze. Did they call you? Yes. This morning they offered me an amazing job, without me even looking for one. Can you explain? He ran his hand across his face in annoyance. It was Celeste. Celeste, my ex, the owner of that real estate agency. It was no coincidence, it's her style. She doesn't make direct threats, she moves the pieces around. She's trying to get you out of my life without me noticing. Julia felt a knot in her stomach. So, there's nothing to know. We're not doing anything wrong. No, but people are already watching us, and when that happens, everything changes. Emiliano looked at her seriously. Julia, I'm not going to let anyone take you away from me. No, not this time. And I'm not going to let them destroy what little I've achieved because of a kiss. He approached her, wanting to touch her hand, but she pulled it away. I need to think, Julia said firmly. This isn't a game and I can't afford to make mistakes. Emiliano understood, didn't press her, just nodded sadly. I'll wait as long as you need, however long it takes. Julia didn't answer. She just closed the door slowly. On the other side, with his heart beating in his throat, Emiliano knew he had crossed a dangerous line, and that love, however sincere, was not always enough to keep things calm. And somewhere in the city, Celeste smiled in front of her computer. She had struck the first blow and knew it was only the beginning. From the moment Julia closed the door that day, she was never the same again. On the outside, everything seemed the same. She got up early, made breakfast, got the kids ready, took care of her parents, and went to work as usual. But inside, her head was spinning. All day long, she thought about the same thing. Why had she let him kiss her? Why had she allowed it? Why did she feel so confused? And above all, what was going to happen now? Work at Emiliano's house became tense, not because he treated her differently. On the contrary, Emiliano remained respectful, attentive, even more patient than before. But that calmness, the way he looked at her without rushing, without demands, without pressure, drove her crazy, because she couldn't pretend that nothing had happened. He could, or at least he pretended to be able to. She couldn't. Every time she saw him, she remembered the kiss. Every time they exchanged a word, her heart raced. And then at night, when she was alone, the fear returned. It wasn't fear of him. It was fear that everything would get complicated, that she would lose her job, that he would get into trouble that she wouldn't know how to handle, that she would be judged, that her nephews would end up paying the consequences of a story that hadn't even begun yet. And above all, she was afraid of trusting and getting hurt. One afternoon, while cleaning the living room, she heard Emiliano talking on the phone in his office. The door was ajar. It wasn't that she wanted to eavesdrop, but she heard her name and stopped with the rag in her hand, her body tense. I already told you not to mess with her, Celeste. She has nothing to do with this. If you want to fight with me, do it face to face. Don't tarnish her name. Julia felt a chill. She didn't hear the answer on the other end of the line, but the next thing she heard left her frozen. If you dare hurt her, I swear I won't stand idly by. He hung up forcefully. Then there was a loud thud, as if she had thrown something. Julia walked away quickly, her steps light, as if nothing had happened, but her mind was already racing a mile a minute. She wasn't stupid. She no longer understood that this woman, Celeste, wasn't going to stop, and that even if Emiliano tried to protect her, she was in the middle of something that was completely beyond her. That night, she couldn't sleep. She thought about talking to Emiliano, asking him to explain everything, but the idea of hearing him say, "Don't worry," scared her more than anything else because she knew he would. He would say that would downplay it, and she couldn't keep ignoring what was already obvious. Someone was watching her, targeting her, measuring her, and that someone had power. The next day, while she was washing the floor after breakfast, she received a message on her cell phone from an unknown number. It just said, "Be careful, you don't know who you're messing with." The color drained from her face. She looked around as if someone could see her from outside. She went to the children's room. She hugged them without saying anything and then went to the bathroom. She closed the door and sat on the toilet seat with her hands shaking. She took a deep breath, once, twice, 3 times. She wasn't going to cry. No, not now. But the fear had already crept into her body like a silent poison. In the afternoon, Emiliano came home with a backpack full of school supplies. It was the week before school started again, and he had bought everything the children might need. Julia greeted him with a forced smile, trying not to show that something was wrong. Emiliano noticed it immediately. "Everything okay?" he asked as he put the things on the table. "Yes," she lied. "I'm just tired." He looked at her silently. He knew something wasn't right. "Sure. Yes." But he insisted. "Julia, if something happened, you have to tell me." "And for what? So you can face your ex again? So I get dragged into gossip? So that in the end, everything turns against me?" The tone came out harsher than she had planned. Emiliano stood still. Finally, she let the truth out. "I got an anonymous message threatening me, and I heard your call. I know you talked to Celeste. I'm not stupid, Emiliano. I'm in the middle of something that's not mine. This is between you and her. I have nothing to do with it. Of course you have something to do with it, because now I care about you, because I'm not going to let anyone touch a single hair on your head. And if you can't stop it, what if she doesn't stop? What if tomorrow something of mine shows up on social media? If they say I'm with you for money, what will happen to the children, to my parents, to my job?" He didn't know how to respond. He knew she was right. He lived in a bubble. She didn't. He could close the curtains, disconnect, disappear if he wanted to. Julia didn't have that option, and that hurt him more than anything else. "Just tell me if you're telling me to go away," he said at last in a serious voice. Julia looked at him. There was so much in her eyes, fear, anger, sadness, love, but she didn't say yes or no. "I'm telling you that I don't know what to do anymore." He took a step toward her, slowly. "Then give me time and I swear I'll find a way to protect you." Julia looked at him, took a deep breath, and lowered her gaze. "I don't want you to save me, Emiliano. I just don't want you to drag me down with you if things get worse." He nodded, then left, but not before looking at the children, playing oblivious to everything, as if the world were still a safe place. That night, Julia stared at the ceiling for hours. She didn't sleep. She didn't cry. She just thought about how she felt, what she wanted, what she couldn't afford, and what, despite everything, had already begun to grow inside her without control, confusion, fear, mistrust. That's how love was experienced when it appeared at the least, with the heart wanting to move forward and the head slamming on the brakes with all its might. Julia woke up with a knot in her stomach. It wasn't hunger or tiredness. It was that pressure you feel when you know the day is going to be difficult, when a decision is approaching that can no longer be put off. The alarm clock hadn't gone off yet, but she was already sitting up in bed, staring at the darkness that barely filtered through the old curtains in her room. Outside, it was still early morning. She could hear her mother's soft breathing in the next room. Sometimes it would stop for a few seconds and then start again, like a motor struggling to keep running. Her dad was already awake. She knew because at that time of day he always turned on the radio quietly to listen to the news while taking his medicine in silence. And the children slept like rocks, hugging each other. Valeria with her foot outside the blanket and Mateo with his school notebook still in his hand. Julia saw them before going to the bathroom. She stood there for a long time, looking at her reflection in the mirror. She didn't look sick or sad, but she didn't look like she used to either. Her eyes were duller, as if her soul were hiding deep inside. She washed her face, combed her hair quickly, put on her work clothes, and left without making a sound. The trip to Emiliano's house felt longer than ever. The truck was crowded and hot, as always. But this time Julia wasn't thinking about the pile of dishes to wash or whether she had to wax the floor again. She was thinking about him, about Emiliano, about the way he looked at her, about how he had approached her without pushing, about how much she liked him and how dangerous it all was. As soon as she set foot in the house, Mrs. Antonia, the cook, greeted her with a strange look, as if she knew something. Julia pretended not to notice. She went straight to the cleaning area, took out her list for the day, put on her gloves, and started as if nothing had happened. But inside, she couldn't take it anymore. Her head was buzzing. A few hours later, while cleaning the guest room, she heard footsteps approaching. It was Emiliano. She knew him so well that she could distinguish his gait. She stopped, closed the bottle of disinfectant, and turned around before he spoke. "We need to talk," she said, Julia firmly. Emiliano looked at her, not smiling. He didn't make any of his usual soft comments, just nodded. Yes, me too. They went out to the garden. It was always easier to talk there, away from prying eyes and closer to the air. They sat down on one of the stone benches under the orange tree that almost no one noticed. I'm quitting, Julia blurted out suddenly. Emiliano was silent. He wasn't surprised. He didn't frown. He just took a deep breath. Why? Because I can't handle all this. I can't wrap my head around it. I'm scared, Emiliano. And it's not because of you. It's because of what this awakens, what it generates. Look at what's happening. They watch me. They threaten me. They offer me fake jobs. And then what? A scandal? A note on the internet? A camera outside my house? I don't want you to go, he said softly. But if it brings you peace, I won't stop you. Julia swallowed hard. It hurt. It hurt too much. She didn't want to give up that job, but even more than that, she didn't want to be away from him. But she was tired of living in fear. And the worst part was that nothing serious had even happened yet. They were just signs, but they were enough. I need distance, time. I need to think carefully about whether this is worth it, she said bluntly. Emiliano looked at her with sad eyes. He had never felt that mixture of admiration and pain at the same time. Julia wasn't running away. She was protecting herself, and that made her even stronger. It's because of Celeste. It's because of everything. She was the spark. But the reality is that you and I come from worlds that don't mix. And no matter how much you want to help me, you can't change that. I have to carry things that you don't see, that you can't see because you don't live them. He didn't argue. He didn't try to convince her. He just went over and took her hand. It was a gentle, calm, sincere gesture. Can I ask you something? Tell me. Don't shut me out. Don't erase this. Don't say it was a mistake. Because for me, it wasn't. Julia pressed her lips together. She wanted to say something, but she couldn't. The lump in her throat was already too big. I'll pay you for the whole month, even if you don't finish. And if you ever need to come back, this door will be open, he said in that deep, calm voice that gave her peace. Thank you, she managed to reply. That same afternoon, Julia packed her things. There wasn't much, a couple of uniforms, some notebooks with cleaning lists, her lunchbox, and a picture that Valeria had drawn for her with crayons, in which she appeared with a giant heart. She said goodbye to the other employees with a discreet hug. Mrs. Antonia wished her luck with a kiss on the forehead. No one asked any questions. Everyone already knew in one way or another that there was something more between her and Emiliano. Before leaving, they crossed paths one last time. They didn't hug, they didn't kiss, they just looked at each other for a long time without saying anything. Everything had been said. Julia walked to the exit without turning around. Emiliano stood there, watching her walk away, feeling like something inside him was breaking silently. It wasn't a final goodbye, but it was one of those decisions that changed the course of a life. Julia wasn't doing it out of pride or anger. She was doing it out of courage, because she didn't want to lose herself in a story she had no control over. And because even though she loved him more than she could admit, she loved herself too. And at that moment, that was the brave thing to do. 3 weeks had passed since Julia left her job at Emiliano's house, 21 days exactly. She hadn't called him once time. She hadn't written to him. She had forced herself to cut off all contact, even though it hurt more than she wanted to admit. She had done it to protect herself, to think clearly, to get some distance. But the truth was that every night before going to sleep, she kept going over in her mind every single thing they had experienced together. The first day he arrived unannounced, the way he treated her dad, the laughter with the kids, the kiss on the couch, and then that last day in the garden. On the outside, her life had gone on as usual. The routine was unforgiving. She had to keep taking care of her parents, take the kids to school, cook, sell food on weekends, and look for other temporary jobs so they wouldn't run out of money. One of those jobs was in a small office cleaning twice a week in the afternoons. Nothing special, but it was something. It was what there was. One Monday afternoon, Julia was leaving work. She was carrying a bag of bread, a carton of milk, and some sheets of paper with the children's homework that the teacher had asked her to sign. The sun was setting and the traffic was chaotic. She walked quickly, without getting distracted, thinking about what she was going to cook that night when she received the call. She didn't recognize the number and hesitated to answer, but something told her to. "Hello, Julia Mendez." "Yes, who is this?" "This is Mauricio, the nurse who works with Mr. Emiliano Arriaga." "I know you don't know me, but I need to ask you something urgent." Julia stopped dead in her tracks, her heart racing. Did something happen to him? His father had a fall. I was with him at a meeting and he fainted. We took him to the hospital. Emiliano came alone. He doesn't want anyone to bother him, but he's alone, very alone. And the first thing he said when he saw his father on the floor was your name. Julia felt her body go cold, put her bag on the bench and took a deep breath. She didn't know what to do. She didn't want to get involved in his life again without being sure, but she couldn't ignore him either. "Where are they?" The nurse gave her the address of the hospital. Julia quickly wrote it down on a napkin she had in her bag, and without thinking twice, she took a taxi. She didn't have money for it, but she didn't care. Something stronger than her told her she had to be there. When she arrived, she asked at the reception desk, explained who she was, and they let her in. She went up to the third floor, her nerves on edge. When she reached the private emergency room, she saw him sitting alone, with a lost look on his face, his elbows resting on his knees and his hands clasped together. He didn't look like the strong, confident man she knew. He looked like a child, one who didn't know if his dad was going to wake up. Julia approached quietly. When she was a meter away from him, Emiliano looked up. It took him a second to react. Then he stood up suddenly as if he couldn't believe she was there. "What? How did you know?" "They called me," Julia said softly, "and I came." There were no hugs, no kind words, just a long look, and then silence. They sat down together. Julia took his hand. He squeezed it as if it were about to break, and she had arrived just in time. They stayed like that without explanations, without complaints, just together. Minutes later, the doctor came out and explained that Emiliano's father was stable. The fall was hard, but there were no serious fractures. He had to be kept under observation as a precaution. The relief on Emiliano's face was so obvious that Julia felt a kind of rush in her chest. She hugged him without thinking. He wrapped his arms tightly around her, as if that hug were the only thing he had left. "Thanks for coming," he whispered in her ear. "You didn't have to say my name if you didn't want me to come," she replied with a half smile. He pulled away a little and looked at her. "I said it without thinking. It was automatic. I don't know, I just thought of you." Julia lowered her eyes. "I've been thinking about you too." That moment was different. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't like in a novel. It was human, real, like when you find refuge in someone who knows your broken parts and still stays. They spent several hours there, talking little. She accompanied him for a coffee in the hospital cafeteria. She bought him a sandwich that he barely touched. She took a sweater out of her backpack when she saw that he was cold. Simple things, but full of meaning. Around 11 p.m., the doctor told them they could leave. Emiliano's father would be sedated and kept under observation. Julia offered to pay for another taxi to leave, but he refused. "Let me take you. Are you sure?" "Yes. I don't want you to go home alone at this hour." They drove down the avenue in silence, the car lights reflecting on the windows. When they arrived at Julia's house, she got out first but didn't go inside. She stood on the sidewalk watching him through the car window. Emiliano turned off the engine and got out too. "Do you want to come in?" she asked quietly. "Are you sure?" "Yes, but just for a little while. Everyone is asleep." They entered silently. Julia left her backpack in the kitchen. She checked on the children, covered her father with another blanket, and then returned to the small dining room where Emiliano was waiting for her. He stood there, not touching anything. "I haven't changed anything," she said. "Everything is the same." "No, you have changed." Julia leaned against the wall, tired. "I don't know if it's for better or for worse." For better, always for better. And it was there, in that tiny space, in that humble dining room, where barely two people could stand, where he approached her again. This time not to kiss her, not to force anything, just to look at her, to be there, to tell her without words that he wasn't going to leave. Julia didn't know what would happen next. She had no answers. She didn't know if they were starting over or if they were just closing something that had never been completely closed. But she did know one thing. She hadn't planned this turn of events, and yet there she was, going back to him, feeling again, trusting again, little by little. And this time without fear. After that night in the hospital, Julia never slept the same again. Something inside her had been lit, or maybe it had never been turned off. The point was that she could no longer pretend that Emiliano didn't matter to her, that she didn't need him, that she could go on alone without looking back, because in reality, from the first day he walked through her front door, life was no longer the same. What she felt that night when she hugged him without thinking was peace, a rare, almost unfamiliar, the kind that doesn't come from comfort, but from certainty. Being with him gave her that, and that was worth more than any fear. 3 days passed since they had met again. Julia didn't call him, nor did he call her, but they both knew that the silence wasn't distance. It was a pause. It was time to sort out everything that had been stirred up inside. On Thursday afternoon, Julia went out to buy eggs and bread. She walked with her mind at elsewhere. All the way there, she thought the same thing. If life wasn't going to be easy anyway, why not live it with what your heart truly wants? Why keep putting up with the cold when she already knew what it was like to feel accompanied? Why keep protecting herself from love when love had also saved her? At that moment, she knew she didn't want to keep pretending that she didn't want him around. Not anymore. The decision was made. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't on a whim. It was because, despite all her doubts, despite all her responsibilities, she also deserved to love and be loved. That night, while the children did their homework and their dad watched the news quietly on the couch, Julia went into her room and wrote a message. It was difficult. She deleted and rewrote it several times until she was left with just one line. If you're not busy, come over for dinner tomorrow. Bring whatever you want, except flowers. No need for those. She sent it and dropped her cell phone on the bed. Her heart immediately began to race, not because she was afraid he would say no, but because of what would happen if he said yes. The reply came 5 minutes later. Tomorrow at 8 o'clock. It's just me, but I'll bring dessert. Julia smiled without realizing it. The smile came out on its own. Dinner wouldn't be fancy. There wasn't time to prepare anything complicated, but she wanted everything to be nice. She cleaned the table, ironed the tablecloth she hardly ever used, borrowed 2 large plates from her neighbor, and hid the children's drawings kits from the refrigerator. On Friday early in the morning, the house had a different atmosphere. The kids were excited, even though they didn't quite understand what was going on. Mateo helped set the table with the silverware. Valeria chose the song that would play in the background. Julia made red rice, chicken and sauce, and a simple salad. Nothing out of the ordinary, but made with love. It was 10 minutes before 8 when the doorbell rang. Julia dried her hands quickly, fixed her hair in front of the hall mirror, and went to open the door. There was Emiliano in a light-colored shirt, no jacket, no bodyguards, nothing that made him look like a millionaire. He was carrying a tray with homemade flan and a container of grapes, and he had his usual smile, but it was softer. "Good evening," he said as if it were the first time. "Come in," Julia replied, still looking at him. He entered slowly and carefully, like someone who knows he is stepping into a sacred place. He greeted her, and Julia greeted him back, still looking at him. "Good evening," he said as if it were the first time. "Come in," Julia replied without taking her eyes off him. He entered slowly and carefully, like someone who knows he is stepping into a sacred place. He greeted the children with a hug and sat down in the living room with them while Julia finished warming up dinner. The meal was quiet, without heavy conversation. They talked about simple things: school, traffic, a TV show Mateo wanted to watch. Emiliano felt comfortable, and so did Julia. There was no tension, no nervous glances, no contrived phrases. Everything flowed as if they had been like this for years. After dinner, the children stayed in their room watching a movie. Julia and Emiliano remained at the table with their empty plates, the warm light from the kitchen, and the leisurely conversation. "Thank you for coming," she said bluntly. "Thank you for inviting me. I thought you were never going to ever." "I thought the same about you," Julia replied. There was a short silence. Then he spoke. "I know this isn't easy. It hasn't been from the beginning, but I can't pretend that I don't feel what I feel because you turned my world upside down, Julia. You made me see life differently, and I don't want to walk away. I don't want to lose you." She stared at him, unblinking. What if something happens again? If they pressure you, if they threaten you, if they come looking for me again, then we'll face it together. But I'm not letting you go, Julia. Not again. Only if you ask me to. She didn't answer. She got up slowly and went to wash a cup that had been left dirty. He followed her, stood close by, didn't touch her, just looked at her. What are you going to say to me? Julia turned around and looked him straight in the eyes. That this time you won't leave. That if you're going to stay, it's for real. That if you're going to get involved in this life, you'll do it with both feet firmly on the ground, not from your car or your office. That's what I want from the bottom of my heart. Then Julia moved closer, not too close, just enough. She took his hand and squeezed it tightly. Emiliano understood that it was a yes, not a loud one, not one from a movie, but a real one. One of those that happen when the fear is still there, but the love already weighs more. They didn't kiss, they didn't need to. The moment was so clear, so strong that everything was said without being said. That night, Emiliano didn't stay. He left late, but he left. Julia walked him to the door and kissed him on the cheek. A slow kiss, one that promised things. He caressed her face and said, "Rest. I'll stop by tomorrow with breakfast, with sweet bread," she said, smiling. And she left. Julia stood at the door watching the truck drive away. She closed the door slowly, went to the children's room, tucked them in again, and finally, after weeks, she let herself fall onto the bed with a different kind of peace. The kind that comes when, finally, after thinking so much, you let your heart take the wheel, because sometimes, no matter how much you try to avoid it, your heart is in charge. And when that happens, the best thing you can do is not interrupt it. The relationship between Julia and Emiliano took shape without the need for grand gestures or promises. He went every afternoon, even if it was only for an hour. He played with the children, helped Mr. Manuel stretch, accompanied Mrs. Carmen while she took her medicine. And in the midst of all that, he always found a little time to talk with Julia, just the two of them. Sometimes they washed the dishes together, other times they just sat in silence drinking coffee, and sometimes they simply looked at each other without needing to say anything. Everything was simple, but real. They no longer hid, but they didn't shout about it either. They knew that their story was delicate, that many would not understand it, and that it was best to live it calmly. Julia was still afraid, but it was no longer the fear she had felt before. Now it was a fear mixed with excitement, like the feeling you get before taking a big step. One Monday morning, Julia woke up feeling strange. It wasn't the flu or a common cold. It was like a slow dizziness, a kind of nausea that came and went. She thought she was tired or that something had made her sick. She didn't think much of it and went about her day as usual. She dropped the kids off at school, bought fruit, made lunch for her dad, and changed her mom's sheets. But on the third day, when the same thing happened, she couldn't ignore it anymore. She looked in the mirror and, without really understanding why, she knew what it was. She felt it. It was that intuition that sometimes women can't explain, but that hits them in the chest like a silent certainty. She went alone to a pharmacy and bought a test. She didn't want anyone to see her. She went back home. She waited until everyone was asleep and took it in the bathroom with her hands shaking. She sat on the toilet lid and waited for those minutes that seemed like an eternity. 2 lines, not 1, 2. Julia froze. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just sat there in silence, with the test in her hand and her head spinning. She couldn't believe it. She had been careful. They hadn't planned anything. She hadn't planned on having more responsibilities. But there it was. She knew it before she saw the result. But now there was no turning back. She was pregnant. She spent the rest of the night awake. She lay down on the bed, but didn't sleep a wink. She thought about the children, their parents, money, the future, and then she thought about Emiliano. How was she going to tell him? What would he think? Was he ready? Was he going to stay? Or was he going to run away? She called him the next day. She didn't want to tell him in a text. They agreed to meet at the small cafe where they had met once months earlier. When Emiliano arrived and saw her looking so serious, he knew something was wrong. "Everything okay?" he asked, leaving his car keys on the table. Julia looked at him straight in the eye. I'm pregnant. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at her. Then he leaned back in his chair as if he needed space to process it. Are you sure? Julia nodded, her eyes filled with fear. I confirmed it yesterday. Seconds passed like an eternity. Then Emiliano leaned toward her, took her hand and said, I don't know how to do this, Julia. I never thought about being a dad, but if you're in this, I'm in it too. She burst into tears, not out of sadness, but out of relief. She hugged him tightly, as if a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. He hugged her back just as tightly. The people around them were watching, but they didn't care. For the first time in a long time, everything made sense. But the calm didn't last. 2 days later, someone, no one knows who, leaked the news to the press. Maybe someone at the pharmacy had seen them. Maybe Celeste had contacts everywhere. The truth is that a gossip website published an article with a photo included. Millionaire Emiliano Arriaga was going to be a father with his former domestic worker. Emiliano's cell phone exploded. Calls, messages, emails. His partners wanted answers. The board of directors was upset. Some investors canceled meetings. Others wanted him to come out and clear everything up. But what hurt him the most was seeing Julia's face when she found out. She heard the news from a neighbor. They showed her the article on their cell phone and she froze. She ran home, locked the children in their rooms, turned off the television, and began receiving calls from unknown numbers. It's true that the baby's father is Emiliano Arriaga. Is she going to marry him? Why did she hide it? Did she do it for money? Julia turned off her phone and locked herself in her room. She didn't know what to do. Her parents were just as confused. Valeria hugged her without understanding. Matteo asked if they were going to take him out of school. The world came crashing down on her. That afternoon, Emiliano arrived at her house. Julia didn't want to open the door, but in the end, she let him in. Did you leak that? She asked him bluntly. Are you crazy? He replied. Of course not. Then it was her, wasn't it, Celeste? She probably wants to ruin me. And if she can do it with you, so much the better for her. Julia leaned against the wall in despair. I can't take this anymore. I just wanted a quiet life. I didn't ask for this, Emiliano. He looked at her with his soul in his eyes. I know, but we're in this together. I'm not going to leave you alone. What now? What are we supposed to do? He took a deep breath. Take responsibility, talk, tell the truth. I'm not going to hide. I have nothing to be ashamed of. I'm with you and we're going to have a child. And that isn't a scandal. It's the best thing that's ever happened to me. Julia looked at him, her heart torn between fear and love. And if they don't understand, then they don't understand. We don't owe them anything. That night, Emiliano released a statement. In it, he acknowledged that he was expecting a child, that he was in love, and that he had no intention of hiding it. He did not mention Julia out of respect, but he made it clear that he was happy. He accompanied the statement with a photo of himself at Julia's house, hugging the children with a genuine smile. The response was mixed. Some congratulated him, others criticized him, but he didn't budge. Julia, for her part, felt stronger than scared for the first time, because now she knew that Emiliano was really there, not just for the baby, but for her, for everything they were, for everything they had endured. The chaos continued, but the love for the first time was no longer hidden. The days following the announcement were a roller coaster ride. Since Emiliano decided to speak publicly about his relationship with Julia and the pregnancy, the peace they had sought so hard had gone up in smoke. The whole country seemed to have an opinion. And the worst part was that they didn't even know the real story. Social media didn't stop. Photos of Julia, some taken from her old profile, others stolen from her private account, were everywhere. There were posts defending her, but there were also cruel, hateful comments. Some called her a gold digger. Others said she was a fortune hunter, that she had trapped him with the pregnancy. Even fake accounts started popping up pretending to be her. The situation hit Julia like a punch in the gut. At first, she tried to stay out of it, not to read anything, not to let it affect her. But that was impossible because now it wasn't just her name at stake. It was also that of her children, her parents, her history. Journalists began to hang around her street. On the corner, parked in cars with tinted windows, there were photographers waiting for a picture, a statement, anything. A reporter approached her in the store and asked her loudly if she was going to force Emiliano to marry her. Another tried to follow her home. The neighbors, although many of them liked her, no longer knew what to think. They looked at her differently, as if she had become someone else. The children began to notice the change. One day, Valeria came home from school crying because a classmate told her that her aunt was a nobody. Matteo became defensive. He hit another child at recess because they teased him, saying that his new dad was rich and they were poor. Julia had to go talk to the principal. She came out with tears in her eyes and a lump in her throat. At home, everything became heavier. She no longer slept well. She didn't eat the same. Her mother, although still ill, noticed her sadness. Her father, from his wheelchair, told her not to worry, that it would pass. But Julia felt that the world was crushing her little by little, as if the simple fact of having loved made her a target. And Emiliano did everything he could to protect her. But he was also under attack. He was accused of being reckless, a bad example for the company, of having lost his mind. Rumors began to circulate in his offices. Some employees criticized him behind his back. Others, out of fear, distanced themselves. His partners began to pressure him to distance himself from Julia and clean up his image. One afternoon, in the middle of a meeting, one of the longest-standing investors spoke without filtering his words. "With all due respect, Emiliano, your personal life is affecting our numbers. What you do in your home is your business. But we can no longer sustain this scandal." He stood up, left his coffee on the table, and stood in front of everyone. A scandal, that's an honest relationship with a woman who has given her life for her family. It's not about whether it's honest or not. It's about perception, image, business. "So find another face for your business," Emiliano said without raising his voice, but with his eyes ablaze. "Because I'm not going to hide, because I love someone who isn't like you." And he left. Later that same day, Emiliano went to Julia's house and knocked on the door as usual, but this time she didn't let him in. She immediately came out and stood in front of him with red eyes. "I can't take it anymore." "I know," he said. "I can't with this. They're destroying me. I'm no longer Valeria's aunt or Doña Carmen's daughter. Now I'm the one who got involved with the millionaire. Do you know what that's like? What it feels like?" He tried to get closer, but she took a step back. "Emiliano, I love you. Don't doubt that. But this life isn't for me. It's not a different life. It's ours. Only now everyone is looking at it and everyone is giving their opinion, and they can say what they want. You and I know the truth, but the truth isn't protecting us. It's dragging us down." Julia lowered her head. He looked at her with pain. He knew she wasn't saying it out of anger, but out of exhaustion, with a weight that could be seen on her shoulders. "So what do you want me to do?" he asked. "I want you to stop, to put an end to this, to get me out of the eye of the storm, to think about the children, about my mom, about my dad, to understand that we can't live in hiding or in fear. I don't know how to live with cameras outside or with questions that hurt. And you want me to go away? No, I just want us to think, to breathe, to find a way to be together without the world destroying us." Emiliano understood, approached slowly, this time without asking permission. He placed a hand tenderly on her face. "I'm not leaving. I'm just going to turn down the noise, but I'm not going to let you go." Julia closed her eyes. She felt that finally someone didn't want to save her, but to accompany her. That weekend, Emiliano canceled all his public appearances, closed his social media accounts, delegated his duties at the company, and took refuge in silence with Julia. They didn't hide, but they didn't expose themselves either. They learned to live between who they were and who the world said they were. It was difficult, but it was necessary. The chaos continued outside, but inside, little by little, they were finding each other again. Because when everything breaks down, what remains is what is true, what survives the scandal, what love, with its own rules, decides to sustain. The media storm began to subside, although not completely. After Emiliano stepped out of the public eye and Julia kept a low profile, the media found another story to devour. The reporters stopped camping outside the house. Some neighbors stopped gossiping. The children returned to their routines. And although nothing was ever the same as before, at least calm returned to the doorstep. During that time, Emiliano and Julia lived almost in a bubble. He spent more time at home than anywhere else. In the mornings, he worked from his studio, and in the afternoons, he sat with the children to do their homework or made coffee for the family. Julia, with her belly already beginning to show, felt calm, sometimes tired, yes, but accompanied. She was no longer alone, no longer carrying everything without help, and that was new and valuable to her. Everything seemed to be falling into place until the most unexpected blow came. And this time it didn't come from the media, or from Celeste, or from outsiders. It came from within someone who had been at Emiliano's side for years. Emiliano's side. Someone he never imagined could stab him in the back. His name was Oscar, and he had been working with Emiliano for more than 10 years. He started as a logistics assistant and worked his way up to become one of his most trusted men. He handled reports, signed documents, attended meetings when Emiliano couldn't. He had access to everything, and that was enough. One Monday, Emiliano was called to an urgent meeting with the company's lawyers. He arrived without suspecting anything unusual, but as soon as he entered the boardroom, he noticed the tense faces. One of the partners handed him a thick folder, and when he opened it, his world came crashing down. There were documents signed with his name, authorizations for money transfers he had never approved, contracts with fake suppliers, million-dollar transactions to unknown accounts, all with his digital signature. "What is this?" he asked, completely bewildered. "Fraud," replied one of the lawyers. "And it's in your name, Emiliano. But I didn't sign any of this. This is fake. No, the signatures are yours. The system doesn't detect errors." "And who had access to this?" No one answered, but he understood instantly. Only one person could have logged into his account, used his passwords, and handled those documents without being noticed. "Oscar," he said with restrained anger. The lawyers nodded. "He resigned 3 days ago. He said he had personal reasons, and we haven't been able to locate him since." Emiliano felt a punch in the chest. Oscar had not only betrayed him, he had left him exposed. And worse, he had done it at the most delicate moment of his life. In the hours that followed, everything was confusion. The partners demanded explanations. The internal departments began to investigate. The press, which had already smelled a scandal, published the news in less than 24 hours. Emiliano Arriaga investigated for fraud in his own company. Julia found out on television. She was sitting in the dining room with a cup of tea in her hand when she saw Emiliano's image on the screen. She felt a twinge in her stomach. The cup trembled between her fingers. The presenter was talking about millions of pesos disappearing, signed documents, internal corruption. She didn't need to hear any more to know that everything was falling apart again. That night, Emiliano arrived later than usual. Julia greeted him in silence. He sat down at the table without taking off his jacket, his eyes dull. "It was Oscar," he said, as if that were the only thing he had to explain. "He sold me out. He used my trust. He took everything." Julia didn't say anything. She approached him and took his hand. He squeezed it tightly. "It's not just the money, it's what it represents. The company is teetering. My partners are already thinking about kicking me out. The media won't stop, and now they're going to come after us with everything they've got. What are we going to do?" "I don't know." It was the first time Emiliano had ever admitted it. Not knowing. He had always had an answer, a way out, an idea, but not this time. This time he was lost. The days that followed were difficult. Subpoenas, documents, calls from journalists, requests for clarification arrived. Julia stopped going out for a while. The stares had returned, and this time they were stronger, because now she wasn't just the millionaire's wife. She was the swindler's wife. That's what some people said and others wrote. And even though Julia knew it was all false, the pain wouldn't go away. The children began to notice. They asked why their Uncle Emmy didn't take them to school anymore. Why didn't they see him smile anymore? Julia made up excuses, but the atmosphere was tense. Even Mrs. Carmen, in her weakness, noticed that something was wrong. One afternoon, Emiliano exploded. "Why didn't I realize sooner? How could I have been so stupid?" Julia tried to calm him down, but he was out of control. "I trusted him. I gave him everything. Everything. And now what? What am I going to do if they take away my company? If I lose everything because of someone who's sat next to me for 10 years? "You're going to fight," Julia said forcefully. "You're going to clear your name. You're going to prove that you didn't do anything wrong. What if I can't? What if they drag me down with you? With the baby?" Julia stared at him. You don't have the right to give up. Not now, not after everything we've been through. He lowered his head. He was on the edge. He knew it, but he also knew he couldn't let himself be defeated. Not just for him, for her, for the children, for what they were building together. And even if the world was falling apart, something inside Emiliano ignited again. Because despite the betrayal, the chaos, and the fear, Julia was still standing there by his side, asking for nothing, just accompanying him. And that changed everything. The last few weeks had been the hardest of Emiliano's life. He had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. Everything he had worked for over the years was falling apart like a house of cards. Every day there was a new note, a new accusation, a new scandal. And although his lawyers were moving around looking for evidence, although he insisted on his innocence, the damage was already done. In the media, the word fraud had already stuck to his name as if it were his second last name. The board of directors of his company voted against him. He was suspended from his position as president temporarily while the investigation progressed. He didn't shout, he didn't beg, he just left the building with his head held high and his eyes steady. Inside, he was devastated, but on the outside, he was still Emiliano Arriaga. That same afternoon, Julia was waiting for him in the backyard of her house with a hot cup of tea in her hands and a serious look on her face. She saw him coming from a distance, his shirt wrinkled, his face tired, and his gaze lost. He came in without saying a word, sat down next to her, and remained silent. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Did they fire you?" Julia asked without looking at him. "Yes, and now I don't know." Julia handed him the cup. Emiliano took it and took a sip. The silence remained, comfortable but heavy. "Are you going to let them beat you?" "No, but it hurts. It hurts because I gave my life to that company, because I trusted the wrong people, because I thought it was enough to work hard so that no one would betray you." Julia put her hand on his leg. "Stay strong. None of this is your fault. And I'm going to tell you something, Emiliano. You are not the company or the suits or the money. You are your way of looking at others, of being there for your loved ones, of getting up every day and keeping on fighting. Don't get confused. What you built is still alive, and it's not in those buildings. It's here with us." Emiliano looked at her with eyes full of tears. He didn't cry, but he didn't try to stop himself either. He just looked at her. And it was as if, for the first time, someone had given him permission to break down without feeling weak. The next day, the country's most widely read newspaper ran a brutal front-page story. "Fall of a Millionaire. Emiliano Arriaga, sunk in million-dollar fraud." The article portrayed him as guilty, without proof. They used harsh words. They called him the millionaire who lost his way, and even suggested that his relationship with Julia was part of a strategy to clean up his image. Julia couldn't take it anymore. That day, without thinking twice, she put on a simple blouse, combed her hair, hugged the children, and headed for the local television station. She knew they knew her. She knew she wasn't a public figure. But she also knew she had to do something for him, for both of them. She asked to speak to the press. At first, no one paid any attention to her, but a young journalist recognized her. The same journalist who, months earlier, had published a neutral article about the pregnancy, made room for her in a small recording studio. Julia sat down in front of the cameras with her hands on her legs, took a deep breath, and spoke. "My name is Julia Mendez. I am not an actress. I am not a businesswoman. I am not famous. I am a woman who fell in love with a man without knowing that that love would turn into a media hurricane. Emiliano Arriaga is innocent. I know who he is. I have seen how he treats others. I have seen how he has cried over this situation. He does not need my defense. But here I am, not out of pity, not out of strategy. I am here because the country needs to see the man behind the name, the one who plays with my nephews, the one who takes care of my sick mother, the one who arrives with sweet bread without anyone asking him to." The journalist asked him to talk about the fraud. Julia didn't hesitate. "I don't have any proof, but I've been watching for years. Emiliano isn't one to take shortcuts. He's one to walk the straight and narrow, even if it makes the road longer. I don't know who betrayed him, but I know who didn't. And it was him." The video went viral in a matter of hours. It wasn't a lawyer speech. It was a real declaration of love. Raw, unadorned, without formal defense. but with the power of truth spoken from the heart. Emiliano saw the video that same night on his cell phone. He was sitting on Julia's bed with her asleep beside him. When they sent it to him, he watched it in its entirety. This time he did cry, in silence. Those tears you can't help when someone saves you without asking for anything in return. The next day, for the first time since the scandal, some media outlets began to change their tone. One article was titled, "The Woman Who Saved the Man," the message that shook the networks. Another said, "What if Emiliano isn't the guilty one?" And as if fate had answered him, that same afternoon a call came. The financial police had gained access to Oscar's encrypted emails. Inside, they found messages with a fictitious supplier and transfers to his name in accounts abroad. It was enough to open a formal investigation against him. Emiliano was notified. The investigation was leaning in his favor. He didn't say anything to the media. He didn't go out to celebrate. He just went back to Julia's house with a bag of warm bread and a calm smile. "Did you bring shells?" she asked, stirring the pot on the stove of chocolate and vanilla. "So, you're recovering." He approached her and wrapped his arms around her waist. He hugged her from behind and rested his forehead on her shoulder. "Thank you for what you did. I'll never forget it. I didn't do it for you. I did it for us. For us, for this life we're building, for everything you are, for everything we can still be." And there, in that simple kitchen, with the stew bubbling and the smell of bread filling the air, Emiliano breathed freely again. It wasn't the end of the problem, but it was the beginning of the comeback, because sometimes the fall doesn't end with a bang, but with a hug that lifts you up. Sometimes life falls apart only to put itself back together better. And that was what began to happen little by little in the days that followed. After it was discovered that Oscar had manipulated everything from within, the media could no longer ignore the truth. The prosecutor's office publicly confirmed that Emiliano Arriaga had no responsibility for the fraud. The charges were dropped, the investigation against him was closed, and the investors who had previously called for his head now wanted his forgiveness. But Emiliano was no longer the same. He did not return to his office. He did not ask for his job back. He did not appear on television to recover his image. Instead, he chose to stay where he had really learned what mattered, in Julia's house, in that kitchen where the walls were filled with the smell of bread and the laughter of children rang out again without fear. The news of his innocence went viral. Yes, but this time he didn't rush to give interviews. All he did was write an open letter on his personal profile, without a lawyer's signature, without staged photos, without an expensive suit. "My name is Emiliano Arriaga. I was accused, tried, and acquitted. I was betrayed from within, and yet here I am. Not out of revenge, not out of pride. I am standing because a woman who owed me nothing defended me as if I were worth everything. That woman is Julia Mendez. And if there is one good thing that came out of this whole scandal, it is that I found her." That letter was shared by thousands, not as an act of fame, but as a sign of what the truth can achieve when it comes from the heart. And from there, everything began to change. Julia, 6 months pregnant, walked more slowly. Sometimes she sat on the sidewalk with Valeria to enjoy the cool air. Mateo no longer hid when someone asked about Emiliano. Now he called him my uncle with pride, Tijon. And Don Manuel, although he still didn't move much, had regained his desire to joke around. Even Doña Carmen smiled more, although she didn't have the same strength. One afternoon, Julia and Emiliano went to the market together, without hiding, without fear. They bought vegetables, bread, and diapers. People greeted them respectfully. Some recognized them, others just smiled naturally. They were no longer the talk of the town. They were a normal couple like so many others, only with a story that had cost them everything. That night, as Julia was settling into bed, she felt the baby's first kick. It was soft, like a little tap inside, but enough to bring tears to her eyes. "She moved," she said excitedly. Emiliano quickly came over, put his hand on her belly, and waited. There it was again, that little touch of life that came to remind her that everything they had been through had not been in vain. "Did you feel that?" she asked with sparkling eyes. "Yes, it's our son saying he's ready to meet this chaos." They both laughed, but deep down they knew it was more than laughter. It was a promise. A few days later, Emiliano made another unexpected decision with the money he had left, because despite the damage, his fortune had not disappeared. He bought a large piece of land on the outskirts of the city. It was not to build a mansion or another business. It was to build a house that would be theirs, with space for the children, for the grandparents, to grow up without feeling watched. He showed Julia the plans one night while they were having dinner. "I don't want you to live locked up or keep welcoming everyone into your house, sweetheart. I want us to have something of our own, big, simple, with a garden, with space to breathe, to live peacefully, to raise our children without them feeling like the world is intruding all the time." Julia looked at him with eyes filled with something bigger than love, admiration, faith, gratitude. "And if the chaos returns, then we'll face it again." But this time construction began immediately, and as if everything had fallen into place. The neighbors were friendly, the workers were respectful, and even the architects seemed to work with extra care. While that was happening, Julia devoted herself to preparing for the baby's arrival. She knitted a colorful blanket. Emiliano built a crib with his own hands, with the help of a carpenter, of course, but he put in the screws one by one. Valeria drew a sign that said, "Welcome, little brother," and she hung it on the bedroom door. One afternoon, when no one was expecting it, Julia went into labor in the middle of a conversation with her dad. There was no panic. Emiliano carried her to the car, called the doctor, and they went to the hospital. Hours later, the twins arrived. Yes, twins. No one knew. The previous ultrasound had shown only one baby, but it turned out that the second one was hidden, close by, quiet, not making much noise. When the doctor said it, Emiliano's mouth fell open. Julia, between the pain and the surprise, could only laugh. "That's what we get for thinking we'd already experienced all the surprises," she said, her voice breaking. "A boy and a girl, 2 new lives, 2 more reasons to understand that everything they had been through had been worth it. That the falls, the fear, the anger, the shame, the exhaustion, everything was part of the journey that had led them there to be reborn." That night in the hospital, Julia held one of the babies in her arms, Emiliano held the other, and the children slept in an armchair. The grandparents had sent voice messages, crying with emotion, and the window let in a warm breeze that asked for no permission. They didn't say much. There was no need to, because when you are reborn, you don't need to explain anything. Just live. The night the twins were born was sweet and silent. In that hospital room with dim lights and the air thick with tenderness, Emiliano and Julia could hardly believe what they had been given. They held Matteo and Valentina in their arms, the girl and boy, perfect, tiny, asleep. Doña Carmen and Don Manuel arrived the next morning, excited, full of photos, flowers, and tears of joy. Valeria and Matteo, the niece and nephew, were happy. They filled the hallways with nervous laughter. They asked when they could see their little siblings. No one wanted to leave that place. Then they returned to the house they had started to build. The land already had walls, roofs, windows, a real house, without frills or luxuries. But it was theirs. It was there with the baby sleeping next to them and the children running among pillows and toys that the revelation came. Julia was in the kitchen making coffee. Emiliano looked at her from the living room while he cradled Matteo in his arms. The baby slept on the other side in her grandfather's arms. No one spoke, only stillness could be felt, the warmth of the home that was beginning to take shape. And then Julia spoke. "There's something you need to know," she said without raising her voice. He looked at her straight in the eye. He didn't understand. He looked at her so calm, so serene, that he felt a blow to the chest. He knew what was coming, but he didn't know if he could go on after that. "When I took the test, he started without looking. When I found out I was pregnant, I didn't think it was yours." He didn't blink. He held the baby in his arms, motionless, waiting for her. "It was rape," she continued in a voice that sounded firmer than she imagined. "Before I started this with you, before I even met you, someone assaulted me. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't talk about it. I didn't even tell my parents because I was afraid they would see me as a victim, and worse, as someone broken. But I've spent 8 months thinking that this baby could have been that broken moment, and I couldn't carry that burden in silence. With you by my side without telling you." He gently put down the baby and approached her slowly. He didn't know what to say. He only knew that the world they had built was shaking again. But this time it wasn't chaos, it was understanding. It was the naked truth, laden with pain and strength. "I didn't know," he said barely. "I know, I never said anything. I didn't want to see you differently. I didn't want you to see me as someone damaged. But today, while the children were playing and the babies were sleeping, I realized that lying to the person who understood me best was the greatest form of harm. You deserve the whole truth." He hugged her. He stood there silently, hugging her back as if it were the only thing he could do at that moment. He didn't let go. He didn't say anything. "And now what?" she asked in a soft voice. "I'm not asking for answers. Just understanding what's going on between us isn't the same. Because this baby didn't come from us. It came from a wound that isn't yours, and I don't know if that changes everything." He didn't let go of her. The voice that came out was clear, soft. "It doesn't change anything. I'm not judging you. Nothing changes between us, except that now I know that this baby is stronger than the pain. It's life built from a wound that you overcame with courage. That makes me love you more, not less." Julia cried, soft, liberating tears. They were not tears of doubt, but of relief, of feeling that she could finally breathe without lies, of feeling that he accepted her completely. Even with that dark chapter, she didn't want to hide. "Really?" she asked without letting go of the hug. "You're not going to look at me differently, ever," he replied. And he said it so softly that it was almost a whisper, even though the rule said not to use that word. "I'm going to look at you more tenderly, more carefully, with more love always, because there is nothing in you that makes me back away, not even what we had before all this." Outside, the children peeked through the half-open door. They had gone out to look for water or something. They saw their parents with the baby sleeping nearby and the warm evening light coming in. They didn't say anything, but the silence was different. A silence that contained truth, protection, and a new promise. That night, while the children slept and the baby slept too, Emiliano and Julia stayed in the living room in silence. But this time the silence was not filled with tension or fear. It was filled with understanding, real intimacy, two people who had been through so much and now knew that despite everything, even though it was difficult, they could be reborn. Because love is not always clean or simple. Sometimes it brings wounds and also the ability to heal together. That was the path ahead. And even though everything had changed, the only thing that mattered was that they were still together more than ever.